In the fall of 2012, every coffee shop from Stanton to Ulysses was telling the same story about clean fields. The story changed shape depending on who was proud enough to be speaking. At the elevator it sounded like efficiency. At the bank it sounded like economies of scale. At the dealership it sounded like bigger equipment needing bigger, straighter runs. But it was the same story all the way through. Fence rows were relics. Shelter belts wasted acres. Brushy edges harbored weeds, rabbits, volunteer trees, and the sort of small inefficiencies modern farming had taught itself to treat as moral failures. If a man still farmed around hedgerows, old Osage lines, plum thickets, mulberry volunteers, cedar breaks, or those ragged strips of grass and scrub that once divided quarter from quarter, people assumed he was either nostalgic, lazy, or too undercapitalized to clean up properly. Out west, where fields were already broad and the wind had always been part of the conversation whether people admitted it or not, the new ambition was openness. Straight lines. Long pulls. Fewer turns. No wasted corners. No brush. No old boundaries telling large equipment how to behave. One of the few men in Grant County who refused that ambition was a farmer named Raymond Kepp. Raymond was 71 in 2012, a Dryland wheat and milo farmer with some irrigated circles, a face permanently browned at the ridges, and the sort of quiet posture men acquire after a lifetime of seeing weather make fools out of confidence. He was tall once, probably, though age had tightened him down a little. He wore canvas coats until the cuffs shone smooth, never hurried speech, and still used phrases his father had used, which made younger men smile the way people smile when they believe age and irrelevance are natural partners. Raymond's farm lay north of Ulysses where the county opened into Long Plains Light and the roads ran between fields so broad a man could believe, if he had not lived there long, that land existed mainly to submit. Around Raymond's quarters, though, old fence rows still stood. Not all of them, and not untouched. But enough to break the eye and slow the wind in ways few of his neighbors now considered worth preserving. There were hedge lines of Osage orange planted by men who had once believed in living fences because wire cost money. There were strips of volunteer elm and hackberry where old corners held a little more moisture. There were grassed seams between fields that had stopped being legal necessity years ago and become, in the county's mind, wasted space. Raymond maintained them. Trimmed where needed, fenced where useful, burned occasionally, cleared only when they became truly harmful. He did not let them go wild. That would have made him easy to dismiss. Instead he kept them functional, and that irritated people more because it suggested intention. His neighbor to the south, Dale Morrow, had spent 5 years pulling out every boundary he could justify. Dale was 50, expanding, clever with acreage, and admired by the sort of local men who call aggressiveness vision once it starts making money. He bought bigger air drills, larger headers, and talked constantly about efficiency per pass. To Dale, fence rows were dead capital. On winter days he liked to stand at the cafe and describe how many extra acres he had recovered by cleaning up old lines. Another neighbor, Travis Ben, younger still and recently back from an agribusiness job in western Kansas, spoke of field edge removal as if it were an obvious step in civilization. "You can't farm 1958 forever," he told Raymond one afternoon after county road work had pushed dust up against a hedge line Raymond refused to remove. Raymond leaned on his shovel and said, "Good thing the wind still knows what year it is." Travis laughed because he thought the old man had made a joke. Raymond had not. Now, if you grew up in western Kansas and paid attention in the right places, you learned about wind before you learned most things that mattered. You learned what bare ground sounds like when March takes interest in it. You learned what a north edge can save and what a bad sweep angle can destroy. Older people remembered dirt drifting over roads, fence wires buried, house steps filled, and fields moving a quarter inch at a time to places they had no business being. They remembered the shame of seeing your own topsoil in a ditch a mile east. But memories decay when seasons get easier, and by 2012 enough relatively cooperative years had passed, enough no-till equipment had improved, enough crop residue had done just enough of the job, that many men began speaking as if permanent field openness carried no serious trade-off. Raymond did not share that confidence because he had watched 2 different springs in the 1970s strip loose ground so badly that his father came in one night with dirt packed in his teeth. He kept the fence rows partly because he remembered stories and partly because he had his own evidence. In his notebooks, he kept them in a cabinet above the basement freezer, where observations going back decades. Snow catch along north-south lines. Moisture differences on leeward sides. Stand survival after winter burn. Places where drifting residue collected and protected spring seedlings. Spots where young wheat held when neighboring stretches got sandblasted thin. Raymond was not sentimental about brush. He knew trees could compete for moisture and harbor trouble if neglected. But he also knew that a field edge is not merely land lost. Sometimes it is a structure holding more than yield maps know how to count. The years leading into 2013 made people bolder than they should have been. Land values were still high enough to flatter ambition. Equipment technology had improved just enough to make operators feel as if they had solved more than they had. Grain programs, crop insurance assumptions, and a whole culture of larger, cleaner operations pushed the county toward simplification. One by one, old fence rows disappeared. Some were pushed with dozers. Some burned and raked. Some cut, chained, and buried. Men stood on pickups and admired how a quarter looked once it had been opened up. They talked about speed, turning efficiency, spray coverage, uninterrupted runs. It all made sense on paper. It often does. Raymond watched the changes without preaching. That was his way. He had long ago discovered that men expanding confidently do not want caution from somebody they already classify as behind the times. When Dale Morrow pushed out the hedge between his East 80 and a rented half-section, Raymond said nothing. When Travis Ben tore out an old plum and osage seam along a county road and then bragged about finally having a proper field, Raymond only asked where the first hard southwesterly would now break. Travis answered by spreading his arms wide toward the open land as if scale itself were protection. By the winter of 2013, Raymond was one of the last operators in that part of the county still intentionally farming around multiple intact fence rows. Then the dry set in. Not a historic drought by first appearance, because western Kansas has seen worse and remembers worse, but dry enough and long enough to make March dangerous if surface conditions lined up the wrong way. Fall moisture had been poor. Winter snow came thin and stingy. The wheat stands across the county were variable, and the looser milo ground that had been worked the prior season carried less armor than local confidence liked to admit. February winds began scraping at the county. By early March, roadside ditches were already collecting light drifts of dust on bad afternoons. Men noticed, of course. But they noticed the way people notice the first cough before a hard illness, with mild irritation rather than fear. Raymond noticed more carefully. He walked the leeward sides of his old fence rows with a spade and found what he expected to find. Where the lines of trees and grass still stood, snow that had fallen in meager amounts had stayed longer. Residue had gathered instead of skittering away. Surface roughness held. The soil beneath those zones felt tighter in the right way, protected without being sealed. In the open interiors the field was drier, yes, but still anchored. He wrote notes. Wind direction, drift pattern, residue catch. It was the sort of information no one values until the day it becomes the whole story. That day came on April 3rd. The forecast had warned of wind. Forecasts always warn of wind out there. But this system arrived with the particular cruelty the plains reserve for certain springs. A hard pressure drop. Dry air. Sustained southwest winds above 40 with gusts well past 60 by midday. The kind of wind that does not move through the county so much as take hold of it. Schools watched buses. Highway crews prepared to post visibility warnings. Farmers stood at windows or at shed doors making the old calculations about whether what was in their fields was tied down well enough to stay where they had left it. By 10 in the morning dust was moving. Not everywhere. Not at first. The best covered no-till fields held. Some irrigated circles with decent residue held. But the wide, clean, newly opened acres where fence rows had been removed and where surface conditions already leaned toward vulnerability began to lift. It started in thin sheets. Then streamers. Then whole pale veils running across the land low and fast. Along county roads south of Raymond's place the ditches filled. Wheat on certain exposed stretches took a hard sandblasting from particles lifted off neighboring worked ground. Visibility narrowed. By noon men were calling each other not to discuss markets or moisture but to ask the old panicked question every plains farmer hates admitting aloud. You holding? The answer, for some, was no. Dale Morrow's big cleaned-up quarter south of Raymond lost first along the long open pole where the removed hedge used to catch snow and break spring gusts. With nothing to interrupt the run, the wind got its hands under fine topsoil and began carrying it east in broad, humiliating sheets. By 1 in the afternoon the road ditch on the far side held a drift of his farm. Travis Ben's field along the county road fared worse because the old plumb line he had removed had once guarded a slight rise that now acted like a launch point. Dirt lifted, crossed the road, and struck the next field with enough force to pepper young growth and bury residue lines. Men drove out and watched their soil traveling. Raymond's fields were not untouched. No field in Grant County is untouched on a day like that. But they held differently. Where his fence rows remained, the wind broke, lifted, dropped, swirled, lost force, and spent part of its violence on branches, grass stems, and rough edges instead of on loose surface soil. Residue gathered in the sheltered strips. Fine particles that might have been airborne stayed home. Snow-catch zones from winter, slight as they were, had translated into firmer structure along the leeward ground. His wheat bent. Dust moved over it from elsewhere. But the soil itself did not begin leaving in the same way. By evening you could drive his section line and see the contrast in one long, uncomfortable lesson. Open, cleaned-up fields to either side showed scoured streaks, bare exposures, and drift lines in the ditches. Raymond's acres showed stress, yes, but not surrender. The county spent that night talking about the wind the way counties always do after weather exposes a fashionable lie. First with adrenaline. Then with selective memory. Some said nobody could have planned for that. Some said the gusts were exceptional enough to make all comparisons unfair. Some said residue levels mattered more than field openness, which was partly true and partly an effort to avoid the more humiliating truth that residue and structure are not enemies. Raymond said very little. He did what farmers do first. He checked stands. He walked edges. He looked for the places where repair, reseeding, or patience might still matter. The worst part came the next morning when sunlight made the damage legible. Along Dale Morrow's cleaned quarter, fine topsoil had lodged in the eastern drainage seam and in the roadside grass. You could see the loss not only in the drifts but in the color change across the field. Lighter subsoil tones showed through where the best particles had gone. On Travis Ben's road field, a strip nearly 80 yards wide had been planed hard enough that early growth looked shelled. Fence wires farther east carried tufts of trash and residue that had not belonged there the day before. County graders spent part of the morning dealing with drifts where soil had crossed roads. Men who had spent 5 years talking about efficiency now stood in pickup beds staring at what efficiency had left exposed. Around Raymond's place, the old fence rows were lined with evidence no one could dismiss. Dust had piled on the windward sides. Residue had collected thick in the grass seams. Small drifts of soil that might otherwise have traveled a half-mile had been caught within his own field system. The sheltered bands behind those rows still held a surface texture worth preserving. And because the windbreak effect had staggered across multiple lines rather than one large shelter belt, the whole quarter had behaved less like an airstrip and more like a series of defended sections. Dale drove over that afternoon. He did not begin with apology because men like Dale rarely do. He stood beside Raymond at the edge of one hedge line, both of them looking south toward the moorrow ground where a pale streak showed exactly where the topsoil had started to move. "Maybe I should have left mine," Dale said. Raymond kept his eyes on the land. "Maybe." Dale waited for more and got none. Finally he said, "You always think they mattered this much?" Raymond answered the way he always answered when truth was simple enough to risk sounding rude. "I never thought the wind forgot." That sentence traveled even faster than the dust had. Over the next week, the county performed its usual sequence after being corrected by weather. It minimized. It rationalized. Then, reluctantly, it learned. The co-op meeting that had planned to focus on herbicide timing and fuel contracts turned partly into a discussion of erosion control. A crop insurance adjuster, driving damage routes, remarked to 3 different people that the only quarters consistently faring better in the blow were the ones with retained edge structure or unusually strong surface cover. Travis Ben, who had mocked Raymond's old boundaries as obsolete, called the NRCS office for the first time in his life and asked what options existed for re-establishing field wind protection without giving up too many acres. He phrased it that way because pride dies a little slower than soil. Raymond did not use the moment to preach, but younger men started coming to ask questions anyway. How far did protection really extend on the leeward side? Were Osage lines better than cedar strips? Did grassy fence rows matter if trees were sparse? What about snow catch? What about rodent pressure? What about spray shadows? Raymond answered as a farmer, not a pamphlet. He said every shelter has a cost. Shade can cost. Competition can cost. Trees require attention. Brush can become trouble. But he also said the county had spent too long counting only the acres visible from the cab and not the inches of topsoil leaving at 45 miles an hour. That spring stayed difficult. More wind came, though none quite as brutal as the April 3rd blow. Because the surfaces on some open fields had already been compromised, later windy days did more damage than they should have. Raymond's farm, buffered by fence rows and seams he had been mocked for keeping, continued to hold better. On certain mornings after nighttime gusts, he would walk the leeward bands and find tiny deposits of moved soil caught in grass and litter, his own field giving itself back to itself. That mattered. It mattered more than people in town understood, because once fine particles leave a field entirely, they do not return with gratitude. By June the visual evidence was unavoidable. Wheat on the badly scoured fields came uneven, thin in exposed strips, stronger where residue or odd roughness had accidentally helped. On Raymond's quarters the stands were not perfect, but they were intact in a way that reflected less abrasion and better surface retention. When the combines finally ran, the yield differences were not mythical. They were practical. Not all of that difference came from fence rows, of course. Weather, rotation, seeding, and field history all mattered. But enough of it traced back to what the April blow had spared that even men inclined to dismiss the comparison had to stop doing it casually. Dale Morrow took the lesson hardest because he had the most pride invested in the clean field creed. That summer he drove with Raymond to the far side of his own quarter and stood by the line where the old hedge used to run before he had pushed it out. The open view was still impressive in the abstract. Long, unobstructed, machine-friendly. The kind of field a salesman photographs from a drone. But Dale looked at the exposed reach and said, never realized how much that row was doing until it wasn't there. Raymond said, most protection works that way. In the fall, while other men were talking about wheat moisture and diesel prices, Dale planted a grass strip on one seam and marked another for a shrub entry mix with NRCS cost share. Travis Ben did the same along his road field, though he tried to present it as a traffic safety decision rather than wind repentance. The county noticed. Counties always notice when proud men reverse without calling it a reversal. By winter, the local talk about fence rows had softened from ridicule to argument, which was progress. Men who had once described old boundaries as wasted acreage now began discussing trade-offs. A few still insisted modern residue management made all that obsolete. Raymond did not argue much with them. He had learned the wind was a better speaker than he was. The years after that did not turn Grant County into a shelterbelt revival society. Too much money, too much machinery, and too much habit stood against that. But the memory of 2013 sat in people's minds like grit under an eyelid. Enough to irritate certainty. Enough that when new renters proposed clearing every remaining line for cleaner passes, somebody in the room usually asked what would happen if the county caught another spring blow on the wrong surfaces. That question had Raymond Kepp inside it even when his name was not spoken. One winter, at a conservation meeting in Garden City, a younger producer asked Raymond whether keeping fence rows was mostly about nostalgia for the old farm shape. Raymond looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Nostalgia is keeping something because it reminds you of the past. I kept them because I know what the wind does to the future." That was the whole case in one sentence. Because topsoil does not leave dramatically at first. It leaves a little at a time, season after season, until one day a hard wind takes enough at once that everyone is forced to watch. Modern farming likes visible efficiencies because they photograph well, calculate neatly, and let ambition feel clean. Fence rows are untidy. They require patience. They force turns. They hold rabbits and shadows and maintenance headaches. But they also hold snow, roughness, moisture, residue, drifting soil, and the memory of a landscape built by people who understood that the plains are only generous on terms that include humility. Raymond Kepp never won an argument at the coffee shop by talking faster than other men. He never sold a county on living field edges with charts or slogans. He simply kept what everyone else tore out. He accepted the jokes. He watched newer men celebrate straighter runs and cleaner quarter lines. Then the wind came, exactly as it had always come and exactly as it always will if the plains are given time enough. And when it did, the land answered the argument for him. His neighbors tore out every fence row. Then the wind came and took their topsoil.